your first leadership in public claim to fame, I don't know, you may have another one, was you published an article about giving away your Legos. So I'm sure some people here know about giving away your Legos because they know you. But what, just describe that idea quickly, if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. So like I said, my first scaling experience was at Google, where my department, just my department, I think larger Google was thousands of people at this time, but my department was 25 people and it grew to 125 people in 9 months. And then I left and went to Facebook, which was like the fastest scale, most places I've ever seen. I think OpenAI is now giving it a run for its money, but it taught that Google experience in particular was actually where I started to develop this metaphor of kindergartners playing with Legos in terms of like how to think about the emotional experience of scaling. The behavior I witnessed was basically that there was so much change happening around people that they were constantly tempted to sort of have a death grip on what they knew they were good at, on the job that had been given, and that I would say the vast majority of the time, if not all the time, that did not serve them. Like if I showed up at Facebook and I spent my first 3 months at Facebook working in the communications team on the social media of Facebook, which is funny. But I had to take over the blog from someone that had built it from scratch. And she was so stressed about that transition. I think there was a lot of opportunity and growth for her on the other side of not running the blog, but she had built it from scratch and she was, very tied to it from an identity perspective. So I basically started talking to people on my team as I, became a manager and a leader there about this idea of giving away your Legos, meaning that like basically the act of being inside of a scaling company is, you're working on a Lego pile that's this big and there's just someone constantly dumping Legos on your head. And so if you stay fixated on your little Lego pile, you actually end up missing all this opportunity that's coming in around you. And so people sometimes ask me like what's the one sentence summary of this article, and I basically say that there are two. The first is don't worry, it's all going to be okay, because I do think that being inside of a rapidly scaling company, the more rapid, the more this is true, it's just an extremely emotional experience. You constantly are having to get good at something and then pass it off, and then get good at it and then pass it off. The second one line summary is I say basically your job is to make yourself irrelevant. Your job is to work yourself out of a job. There was a phase in the most rapid part of my scale at Facebook where I felt like I was literally working myself out of a job every 3 weeks. And, part of that was just because the company was growing and changing so fast that there was constant demand for me and other people to level up and grow and grow. There's huge amounts of opportunity in that, and it's very stressful. It is not a natural human motion to get good at something and then let go of it, but it creates, I ended up working in communications and then HR and recruiting. And then I worked in business development and partnerships. And then I worked in product. And so, you don't get those opportunities unless you get good at sort of getting good at something and passing it off and making yourself irrelevant. So that is what Give Away Your Legos is about.
Well, I love that model, and I think the brilliance of it is it was such a catchy way to express it, right? Because the idea, of course, if you need to delegate or let go of your responsibilities, people have heard, but to make it accessible that way. I certainly had your experience when I was going through rapid growth startups early in my career. They may not have been quite, I don't think I was ever on a 3 week cycle, but I said every 6 months, I get to divide my job in half and keep the part I want.
Yeah.
Was my experience. And that, again, is I was like you, 23, 24, 25, and I'm like, wow, this is wild. I'm like cutting my job in half and giving half of it to somebody I just hired and keeping the half. But the neatest thing about that is you can keep kind of the half you might find fits you.
Yeah. Nope.
And it doesn't mean
Exactly
the
the
other
same.
half was bad. It just means it fits somebody else well.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so I noticed I was watching what you posted on LinkedIn. I think in a couple days or maybe soon, I may not have the time frame right. Jason will no doubt post the link. You're doing a Maven class, Maven Lightning lesson about hyperscale growth, right? So my question is, most of the people I talk to, the biggest, I don't necessarily agree with it, but they come to me with like, oh, big tech's not growing. There's layoffs everywhere. No one's hiring. It's all dim and grismal, like bad. And here you are teaching about hyperscale. Help me a little bit, first with like, are people would love to hear if you're seeing a lot of hyperscale, like where it is or how to find it.
Oh
Because
yeah.
apparently you think it exists, and broadly speaking, most people don't think it exists right now.
Um, it definitely exists, but I think it's important to understand to some extent what happened inside of tech in the last, 5 years. Yeah, five, four. Um, So, number one, I would say let's talk about what scale means because I don't count scale in terms of number of employees. For
Okay.
a long time, that was the badge of honor for founders and for people. Oh, we tripled our headcount in the last year, whatever. And for me, the question was always great. How fast did your business grow? And I think, up until 2021 or 2022, we basically saw a lot of companies that were focused on uh, scaling employee headcount ahead of their business. It was often a mandate from the board of like, hey, we gave you this money, you need to grow and scale. And a lot of founders don't understand necessarily the fundamentals of businesses. So they weren't looking at unit economics. They were just thinking somehow that more people would equal more productivity or that the business would catch up or whatever. And, what you saw happen in sort of late 2021 and 2022 was a huge correction of basically, I mean, part of it was the Web3 and crypto space taking a sharp right turn, but a lot of it was just that overall, the economy and venture funding sort of no longer wanted to support unreasonable scale where your employee count scaled ahead of your business. So in general, I would actually say the reset has been very healthy because I think founders and investors are much more focused on healthy scale, meaning, what is the smallest company what is the smallest number of employees you can use to scale this business well versus somehow employee count being a badge of honor. Um,
Right.
that said, what I would say is when I think about hyperscale, the question I ask is how fast is your business growing? And I would say every company has a graph that they look at, the big ones, every all hands, every, if they're public, every earnings report. And that graph is a graph of how fast, they measure their business. This is our, at Facebook, it was monthly active users, and that graph was like, very vertical for a very long time. And I always say to people, when you look at that graph, you should understand it as a graph of how fast your business is growing, but you should also understand it as a graph of how fast your job is changing. And that also is a graph of how fast you have to grow to keep up with your company. So for some folks, they look at that graph and it's like 2xing every year. That is still growth. It just means that, like, again, the rate of the Legos being dumped on your head is a little bit less intense than if you're doing what, for example, OpenAI is doing right now, where they're going from like 4 billion to however many tens of billions of revenue in 1 year. So I think it's really important to focus on the kind of growth that matters. But there are absolutely there have been for the last 5 years, businesses inside of tech that are growing really fast. I think the time of, sort of, I think the pride metric now is actually going to be an efficiency metric. How small is your team relative to the impact of your business, which was not true for the 5 years before that. And that is partially obviously due to AI and partially due to just this sort of reset in terms of what investors are expecting from a cost basis inside their portfolios. So again, still lots of great companies in tech. It's just frankly a different culture than it was 5 years ago.
Yeah, absolutely. You've had the rise, obviously, of Jensen Huang and the idea of very flat organizations and a number of changes. Brian at Airbnb talking about founder mode. There's been a lot of. I agree with you that what is now considered important has moved. And being a little older, I'm thinking than you, uh, I had the honor, quote unquote, in the late 90s of being part of the first internet bubble where I was on a startup. I was in a startup. I was sitting at the board meetings. I was not a founder, but I was in the room when Goldman Sachs gave us a bunch of money, and I actually heard the immortal words, "Now get big fast," like the trademark quote. And among other functions, I ran recruiting, a similarity we have. I grew the company from 50 to 150 in a year, so quite quickly, tripled. And then I ungrew it back to 50 in 6 months after that, as the market turned. Um, and so I've seen both sides of this curve. I got to ungrow myself in that process and find a new opportunity, which was also like, there is a special experience to putting yourself on the layoff list when you're contemplating who does the company no longer really need. And as you shrink, the guy who's running recruiting, may not be your most essential component.